Hi, I'm Ben Goldsmith, and I host a podcast series called Rewilding the World, which seeks to highlight some of the extraordinary nature restoration projects that are taking place across the planet today. Now, on Rewilding the World, we meet inspirational people who are making these things happen. Each episode is a dose of optimism. Search Rewilding the World wherever you get your podcasts.
Rewilding is about taking a step back and leaving nature alone to let it do its thing. We've already interfered enough, and we've seen where that's got us, especially in relation to the wild salmon. But in the industrialized 21st century, can rewilding really be achieved? And if so, at what cost? Ben Goldsmith certainly believes it can and must be done, and he is one of its foremost champions. It was only after the tragic death of his teenage daughter Iris, however, when she was just 15, that, in grieving, Ben found solace and hope through the embrace of nature. And ever since, Ben has been on a mission, a personal crusade to increase rewilding initiatives, not just throughout the UK, but throughout the world, internationally, and he has achieved so much already. If you listen to his podcast, Rewilding the World, you will be educated on his endeavors. Ben joins us on The Last Salmon to share with us his story and what gives him his unique drive, and it's certainly something I can personally relate to.
The darkness that engulfs you in the moments after something like that happens. Iris died incredibly suddenly. We were playing cricket, and I was walking around the boundary with my son and got this telephone call from my ex-wife Kate. Her partner Paul was running ashen-faced around the boundary and got to me breathless and handed me the phone. Said, "It's Kate. There's been an accident." It's that call that everyone dreads, every parent dreads, And initially I thought, well, what, she's a foolish girl gone and done, 15 and a half, always getting herself into scrapes, but fundamentally responsible. And she'd been driving vehicles around our farm and helping around the farm and so on for years, since she was 8 or 9 years old. They were, they're competent, responsible kids for the most part. So I sort of thought, what's she done? And Kate said, "She's not breathing, Ben." And my legs kind of went out from under me. I managed somehow to give the phone back to Paul, get to another phone. I kind of fell into a temporary structure in which some builders were having their tea. There was a building site next to the cricket field, and I sort of sank to my knees and begged them, "Help me, something awful's happened. My daughter's had an accident. Help me. And these men didn't know what to do. One of them tried to feed me some fizzy water, and then my friend Ben Elliott came in and said, "Look, just hold it together for 30 seconds. Your boys are outside. We just need to get in the car, and we're going to go, and we're going to meet Kate at the hospital." And so I got out. I said to my boys, "Everything's all right. We're going to go to the hospital." I got in the car with my friend Ben. Off we drove, the boys following in Paul's car. And I called the people at my farm, my neighbor, the guy who runs the farm. No one picked up, no one. And then Kate called me, who was in another car, dashing there as well. And she said, "You know why they're not picking up, don't you? They can't tell us over the phone that she's dead." And I said, "Please don't say it. Please don't say it." And, these are the most desperate hours of my whole life, we arrived there, but by luck, at exactly the same time. And my wife, because I married a second time, when Iris was, say, 12, my wife Jemima had also had the call and was Zooming, on the train from London, where she works as a chef. And I arrived with my ex-wife at exactly the same time, and we found an ambulance there, and a couple of paramedics, a couple of police, people milling about, looking awful. And are you Benjamin Goldsmith? Are you Kate Rothschild? Do you know what's happened here? No, your daughter's unfortunately been killed in an accident. And I could see just over the lip of the hill, I could see that awful vehicle, those wheels pointing up towards me, lying on its side, and and there she was, on the gurney in the back of the ambulance, looking so beautiful, that profile, I knew so well. And she was just turning into a young woman. She was 15 and a half. And there she was, just lying there so serene. Seemingly no injuries. Just 2 flecks of blood underneath each nostril. And I had to sort of hold Kate, because she was, I had to sort of hold her because she was not able to stand well. And she was crying at them, "Please, please just try. There must be something, please." And obviously there wasn't anything that could be done. And then we had to pull it together quite quickly. The boys arrived moments after and had to just get out the ambulance and shut the side door and tell them what happened. And in those moments, a darkness descends. And I remember thinking, I got to live. This is the how can this be happening? But it is, and I got to live. I've got two little boys here. I've got an ex-wife, a wife. I've got two toddlers. I've got a mother, a wider extended family. All these people are going to look to me now. Like I can't fold away. You want the world the earth to swallow you up, and I remember a thought just passing my mind as I walked down the lane towards the house, dumbstruck, on my own. And there was a police car at the other end of the lane next to the house waiting for me. And I knew I was going to have to sit in that car and talk to him and do all that admin. And I remember just momentarily thinking, my God, the world is beautiful. How can I have that thought now? It was a midsummer's late afternoon. All those little bits of flotsam drifting in the air, the seeds of the willow and the kind of little tiny insects and little butterflies and dragonflies, and the sunlight penetrating the canopy above my head, and flowers of late summer on both sides of the lane, the purple loosestrife. And I thought, wow, how can I be thinking that the world is beautiful in this moment? And it was a fleeting thought that reoccurred to me again and again during subsequent hours and days. And I found that the darkness and the misery of the grief, the anxiety, I think it was C.S. Lewis said that grief feels like waiting. It's like you're waiting for something, but what are you waiting for? There's nothing to wait for. Or Joan Didion, who wrote in Blue Nights, she said it's like a fear. It's a constant fear. It kind of waxes and wanes. The relief came, those moments of light that penetrated the darkness, they came in the form of moments spent in nature. Sitting with a cup of tea in my hands, first thing in the morning, listening to the bird song, watching the birds skitting around, the scrub around my house, jumping in my pond and emerging, blinking out of the water and seeing the kind of dragonflies chasing each other across the top of the water. This kind of indifferent kind of benevolence of nature all around. I felt it held me, and it was just moments of relief. And you grab those with both hands because that's how you survive. The moments of levity, moments of relief, and then as the weeks and months went on, and I found the kind of childhood love of nature I'd had, this fascination with nature and wildlife, I realized then it hadn't been a hobby. That this was some kind of yearning, some kind of words I would never have used before I lost Iris, but some kind of spiritual connection. It was like nature holding me during the darkest time of my life, and that was the source of all of my kind of re-emergent kind of living, or meaning, joy. Just to tell you that briefly, 3 months after Iris died, a pair of beavers set up residence on our farm, and beavers have returned to the rivers around this part of Somerset. By miracle, but they weren't on my farm. I didn't know that I had the habitat really for them. It was just a kind of ditch along the bottom. It's a source of the River Froome, which had once been a great salmon river, and it becomes the Somerset Avon and flows out towards Bradford, Bath, Bristol. And I saw the unmistakable sign, the sharpened pencil of the willow stumps along the side of the ditch. And over the next months of autumn and winter, I watched with fascination and joy, the first real joy that I felt as they built their lives and their territory, and they created this string of what looked like Japanese rice terraces, these little dams all along the bottom of the valley, and the light poured in because they cut the trees down for building material and food. And so my love of nature, my obsession with nature carried me through a very, very difficult time and continues to carry me through a very difficult time.
Thank you for sharing that. I know that you have no doubt told that story a number of times now, and I know from personal experience, it doesn't necessarily get easier, but it helps every time you say it out loud, and I can see that in your face, and you learn something new about the experience, about yourself, every time you relive it, really. So thank you. The freshwater aspect, what I particularly hooked onto there was you jumping in your pond, seeing those beavers, seeing those sharp pencil gnawed willows. There's something about water, isn't there? There's something about water. I know it's a cliche. There's the healing properties of water, but I know that your experience in freshwater and in nature is something that has helped you and me immeasurably. I just want to talk a little bit more about that. What do you think that is?
It's mysterious, isn't it? I mean, it may be as simple as the fact that we are substantially made of water. And we're kind of coming home when we're in water. I mean, our cells are full of water. I've found all my life that being in water is a great joy, and at times of difficulty, it makes you feel okay for a moment. You jump into the sea. If you're feeling anxious, you're feeling tired, you're feeling hungover, you're feeling grief-stricken, you're feeling angry, whatever it might be. It's always fixed by diving into water, especially wild water. I've never been a huge fan of swimming pools. They're fun to play in with your children, but I've never loved a kind of chlorinated swimming pool. I prefer a salty one by the side of the sea. And jumping into the river or the pond, fresh water, I think is it's something that I've really loved whenever I've had the opportunity since I was young. Like I would always think when I go abroad or I travel somewhere in England, where could I swim? And here in my place in Somerset, there's a bend in the river where we got some diggers in one winter and opened up a kind of swimming space. It's the river. When I say river, it's really a trickle, or it had been until the beavers arrived, and now there's this wonderful, sort of 20-foot wide, kind of spongy, terraced wetland that runs along about a mile of the valley, and it's now the center of life for us and for wildlife in the whole area, because water is life, and the beavers have engineered the landscape such that it holds water. And there, right in the middle of it, is this kind of resplendent pond with a little island, my pride and joy, and a little wooden pontoon. And I go to it and swim in it all the time. I'm not that brave in the middle of winter. I normally do it to show off, or as part of some kind of challenge with my older sons. I might swim very briefly and shriek a lot in kind of December, January. I'm not a cold water swimmer really, but from kind of April till October, it's a huge part of my life. And why water? I think it for me, it's partly about the fact that this is the epicenter of life on the farm. I think that water is where the action's at. It's where if you sit quietly, there are bats in the early evening skimming the top of the water looking for insects to eat. It's where you might spot a kingfisher. It's where in the middle of winter there are ducks and wading birds and noise, and it's just a riot of life all year round. It's where all around the water is where the color is, all those flowers of wild mint. And so it feels to me that if I want to show off the rewilding of this valley, I take people straight down there and I walk along the watercourse, and I've mown a kind of track so you can walk quite close all the way along for about a mile. And I think it's partly that, and it's partly about this kind of immersion into nature. That thing when a baby is so sweet, you just almost want to bite it. I've got a little girl called Paloma who's 15 months now, and kept me awake last night for a good 2 hours, which was on some level rather a joy. Sort of my appreciation of everything is kind of changed now, and it was part annoyance but part pure joy. And but little Paloma, you kind of want to bite her, and I think there's a thing about wanting to immerse oneself in nature, and water allows you to do that, kind of really be in it, to kind of be part of it, in a sort of physical way. And I think that for me is partly what it's about, this jumping into the pond and feeling like getting a frog's eye view of what's going on around me. But what I knew at that time is it just makes you feel better.
Undeniably it does. And it sounds like it's very, very wrapped up in Iris and her memory and her spirit as she lives on. I thought it was so beautiful. You were talking about the reason why it was so important to you was that there was life there. It was the life of the farm is in that pond. We've recently spoken to Robert McFarlane, who's written a book, fantastic book. I'm sure you've heard of it, may have read it, Is a River Alive? And that talks about giving more rights to nature, more rights to rivers. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think a river is alive? Let's call it fresh water, shall we?
Yeah, so I can't wait to read Rob's book. I mean, Rob is a poet. I haven't met him, but he's got a real way with words and illuminates kind of what nature means to me in a beautiful way. I think it's a brilliant legal mechanism, this idea of giving personhood or giving kind of rights, the rights that a person would have to, for example, a river. A river's an obvious one because rivers mean so much to people. Think of what the Seine means to Parisians, or the Mersey to Liverpudlians, or the Nile to Egyptians. The rivers run deep in our consciousness, both collective and individual. And I guess that's because water is the source of life, and that's the reason why they mean so much. But I mean, I don't know if you've read a brilliant small book by Hermann Hesse called Siddhartha, where he finds joy as a ferryman living beside the river, a life of simplicity, and I think it's a book that all young people should read at some point. So I think rivers provide a useful cultural hook, and they also provide a useful legal hook. I mean, of course, I think all nature is alive. I'm a sort of subscriber loosely to the James Lovelock idea of Gaia. I think that there is a singularity. That nature that we are part of a singular, conscious, living organism of some kind, and I think much of that singularity is hard to describe in words. What does it really mean? And I think the religions and other spiritual traditions make a valiant effort, as do the poets and the artists and musicians and so on, to try to describe something that is beyond describing, possibly in words. So I certainly, that's how I felt when I lost Iris, is where has she gone? And she's gone to that. And why does nature make me feel so good in this time of unbelievable, unbearable loss, rage, injustice? This irreversible event makes me feel so desperate, and yet nature is balm for my soul at that time. Why? And I don't think that can be answered very easily using logic or words, but I think nature is the face of something that is ineffable. It's kind of, or a mirror. I've seen it described in some writings, the idea that nature is a kind of mirror on which is reflected something that we can't necessarily understand or describe. And so this idea of nature being given rights as a living being, I think, makes perfect sense to me. I think there's a real problem in our society at the moment, that nature is a kind of larder to be exploited and raided, and not a living thing. And a book that had a huge impact on me when I was young was the then Prince of Wales's book Harmony, which he wrote with Tony Juniper. And he describes the Enlightenment, of kind of Descartes and the sort of Enlightenment philosophers as being the beginning of the problem, because anything magical, mysterious, and invisible was placed in a box somewhere up in the sky. That's where God is. That's where spirits are. And we live in a mechanistic world. These are all machines. I think he dissected his dog alive in order to demonstrate that it's just a kind of biological machine. And I think that that's the root of the problem, is that we've separated the divine from what is physically real to us, and that wasn't the way through history. So I think Rob McFarlane's idea of giving personhood to a river is a brilliant one. But of course, our rivers are nothing like what they should be or once were. Now, this idea of a river as a single ribbon of water running across a landscape is a modern idea. They would have been multi-braided, shape-shifting beings that would have changed their boundaries and would have had the islands and all kinds of things happening in them. And we've obviously engineered our rivers beyond recognition. So I think giving them personhood might be a step towards restoring natural rivers.
Just talk to us a little bit about your rewilding efforts. Is that something that you stepped up since losing Iris, or is this something that you've always been driven to achieve?
Look, I was always obsessed with nature and wildlife. I didn't know the term rewilding, but I dreamed of rewilding as a child. I've got a letter somewhere from when I was 11 years old from the nice gentleman that ran Richmond Park at the time, where I grew up on the edge of Richmond Park, in a place completely surrounded by nature in the suburbs. And I'd asked him why we can't have wild boar in Richmond Park, and he wrote me a very patient and lovely reply. And my father was quite an absent father. I adored him and hero worshipped him, but really his visits were kind of, they were sort of typhoon-like for kind of 3-4 days at a time, a few times a year, and otherwise he was off. So I used to correspond with him about the rewilding, a word we didn't use, that he was doing in France and in Mexico, removing enormous numbers of plantation monoculture, Sitka trees in France, and reintroducing ocelots in his place in Mexico. So I grew up steeped in the idea of restoring wildlife, restoring landscapes, and this is all I kind of obsessed over. I wouldn't have had any kind of sort of spiritual language to use around that. It was kind of like my hobby. I wouldn't have used that word either, but I do remember sitting next to, a nice old lady at some dinner my mother put on, and she said, "Oh, you're the one that loves nature," And I remember thinking, "I do," but as if it's sort of stamp collecting. And I think it was losing Iris that brought my love and fascination to a whole new level, and it became obsessional partly as a survival technique. I gave Iris an iPhone far too young. I wouldn't give my new batch of children an iPhone at 12, but she had one, and she sent me this video after hopping off her pony and coming across a large flock of starlings in a field. And you just listen to the joy and the awe in her voice in the presence of a natural spectacle.
And look, they're going up. Look how giant that is. I was right next to them.
That means a lot to me, that she loved nature the way that she did during her short life. And so what I'm doing here in Somerset, rewilding a few hundred acres and actually a few thousand if you include various neighbours. That, Heal Somerset is a community-funded NGO next door that's rewilding nearly 500 acres. You've got a whole bunch of things happening in this part of Somerset, contiguous habitat on a landscape scale being brought back to life. For me, it's a kind of love letter to Iris, and it's where I find some kind of ongoing connection with Iris. I find myself wondering out loud, isn't this great, Iris? Just look at, I sort of want her to see it and know it. And maybe at moments of kind of, low moments, I might allow myself to wonder if she is it, or if she's in it,
I mean, low moments, maybe. I think every moment of every day, that is, sounds like that's the question, and indeed the answer. It's such an inspiration to hear you talk about what you do and how connected it is to Iris's memory and to keeping it alive. We're very conditioned, aren't we? I think it's a British thing. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's a Western thing to, once people have passed on, we talk about them less and we think about them less. And that's the thing to do. And it's utterly anti-love. It's anti-family. I've never understood why we don't keep people's memories alive by having them on our tongue, having them in our consciousness, doing things for them, because of them, and with them still. It's and to hear your story, Ben, is, I know, will help when people are listening if they've been in a similar situation of loss. It really is an inspiration to me as well, and I've been in a similar boat. It's so great to hear.
One of the things that was very meaningful for me that was said a couple of days after Iris died by the mother of a friend of mine whose brother had died in a car accident. She said, "A short life has no less validity than a long one." It took me a while to absorb those words, and I now understand, I think, what she meant by that. And I think that I'm drawn to the idea of time as a kind of necessary and deeply persistent illusion, in which we live our lives. But this idea that existence doesn't take place within time, but instead that time is something that kind of occurs like bubbles or circles within existence, and that existence is somehow outside of time, this idea of a kind of eternal now. And we're right at the outer limits of my ability to articulate what I've been thinking about. But I do feel that being in nature, for you, that might be standing, fishing for salmon on a river for 12 hours, or it might be a few moments plunging into my pond for me, or whatever in between. It feels for a moment like being outside of time. And I think to the extent that, that Iris is still with me in some way, with us in some way, is that she's outside of time, and the time is that, I love that Edgar Allan Poe quote. He said, "All that we see or seem is but a dream within a dream." Well, Iris has somehow woken up from some level of dreaming and exists in some place outside of time. And I think that's an interesting idea, especially for those of us, you lost your daughter very young. Iris was only 15 and a half. Does it matter, the number of years? And I think on one level, of course it does. In this physical world that we live within the Edgar Allan Poe's dream, it matters a whole lot. And that's why I say Iris was 15 and a half. The half matters a great deal. But on another deeper level, maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe there is no time.
Wow. This is really, sorry, Ben, this is such a moving conversation for me for so many reasons. So bear with me. Different levels, different scales of rewilding. If we can go back to rewilding, because some of our listeners. It's a generic term now. It's perhaps been hijacked in more cynical rooms. Very briefly, tell us what rewilding is in 2025 and what levels or scales there are.
People get very hung up with terms, especially this rewilding term. And I understand, kind of various different angles on it that people have. I think some people want to discredit the term because they want to discredit the idea that lies beneath it. I'm pretty relaxed about the use of rewilding. I mean, I think if someone living on the 44th floor of a tall building in Roehampton decides that I say Roehampton because I could see those tall buildings across the park from where I grew up, and they've got window boxes and they want to have wild annual flowers in order to attract pollinators to their window. For me, that's rewilding. They've rewilded their window box. I think it's about making places more amenable to wild nature. Rewilding a suburban garden by planting a native hawthorn in the corner and digging a little pond and being a little bit less tidy obsessed about the way you run it. I mean, that you're a rewilder, in my opinion. And of course, there is a spectrum, and that window box is one end of the spectrum. And the American Prairie Reserve in northern Montana is at the other end of the spectrum. I was woken up this morning to a message from a friend of mine who's in Montana right now, and he said, "Look, dawn on the prairie." And in yesterday's trip out, and he showed me these incredible videos of bison across this plain where American Prairie Reserve is ripping out thousands of kilometers of barbed wire fencing and restoring natural hydrology and restoring the migratory bison and putting back various other species, Blackfoot ferrets and different kinds of foxes and all these North American animals I don't know so well. So obviously that's at the other end of the spectrum, and anything in between. So I don't get hung up, but I like the idea, obviously, of the kind of the natural processes being the governing force of nature and nature restoration. So that's been the principle of my rewilding here in Somerset. Now I've restored 4 natural processes that I think are key to the re-emergence of the kind of scrub-rich, dynamic mosaic of woodland and semi-open habitats that would have been dominant here for miles, maybe 200 years ago. I'm in a valley that's not good for farming. We're grade 5, grade 4, grade 5 heavy clay, try to get machines onto it or do anything on it. And it's kind of the battle of the salient at Ypres for half the year and kind of baked concrete for the other half of the year. And when Iris was around, we had 50 cattle and 50 sheep, and 80% of the farm was just not a place we went. There wasn't much to do. Gates and posts and fences and all that stuff. So we pulled all of that out and we broke up the field drains that are beneath the ground, and we drove a mole plow over them and you hear them popping underneath, and we blocked up the ditches and then initially just left nature to heal quietly by itself before introducing the natural processes. And I'm led to believe that the 4 most important natural processes in the British landscape or Northwestern European landscape are as follows. The first being the browsing and grazing of some kind of heavy bovine herbivores. So historically, before people, that would have been aurochs or bison. Domestic proxies, native cattle, the Old English longhorns is what we have, fulfill exactly the same purpose. In their absence, you would have a closed canopy forest here within a dark closed canopy forest within about 30 years. So they're munching on the little scrub and trees that come up and creating this kind of dynamic semi-open system. And we've got them mooching about. I can almost see them out of my window right now. The second, pigs, rootle the soil and kind of create space for more delicate ephemeral wildflowers and trees to germinate. Aspen, black poplar, all those trees that grow along good salmon rivers, they all need the work of pigs. And then third is beavers, which came in 2019, as I said, and created this wonderful wetland habitats and hold water in the landscape. And most importantly, sunlit water in the landscape, which is vital, not those kind of tunnels of willow that you get in the absence of beavers. And then fourthly, we don't have wolves or any kind of natural predation of ungulates and deer and wild boar and so on. But we do have a man called Derek with a big moustache, who is a game dealer and stalker, and he and his people almost know the deer that live here by name, and they know exactly what they're doing, and they selectively cull about 30 deer a year. And you've got to have that control, otherwise you end up with too many herbivores and overgrazing. And so I like this. The medievals had the concept of nature as a kind of infinitely complex clock. You've seen those images from kind of medieval iconography of these clocks that are kind of intricate beyond comprehension. And I like that idea of nature as kind of innumerable interactions overlaid onto interactions. And this idea that some of the motors within that mechanism are more important than others or more impactful than others. Well, the four that I described are the ones that we've restored here in this valley, and it's working. I mean, it's like we have hockey stick increases in everything that we care to measure. 800% increase in yellowhammers. Almost every survey which we do seasonally of birds produces one or two new species. We've got nightjars this summer. First time in recorded memory, we've got nightjars here in this valley. So just cool stuff happening. So we have 5 rivers that emerge within about 3 miles of where I'm sitting now. So you have the Stour that emerges by Stour Head, and that flows off down towards Bournemouth in Dorset. It's Dorset's largest river. We have the Wylye just over the ridge in front of me that gives Wiltshire its name, flowing east towards Salisbury. You have the Somerset Froom rises on my farm, and it is the stream that runs across the farm that has been beavered. That's a Somerset Froom that becomes a Somerset Avon, and then flowing west, you've got the Brew and the Alum rising just to the west of me, and those, of course, deliver much of the water that should become the Somerset levels had we not engineered the water away. And if that was still our Danube Delta, if Glastonbury still had the glassy water that gave it its name, shimmering around it during the winter, then much of the water comes from here. So it seems like a pretty obvious place to prioritize hydrology and water storage and nature over food production, because it's just not very productive land in a farming sense.
When we talk about salmon and we talk about rewilding in the same sentence, we think about planting trees, restoring banks, creating shade, trying to keep river temperatures low for spawning for the fish themselves as well as the eggs, and trying to sort of go back in time a little bit for certainly the uplands and the spawning areas of the river, and recreate those wiggles as you talk about, and the delta system really that the salmon would thrive on. And we get a lot of kickback from naysayers who say, what's the point? The analogy I hear a lot is, what's the point in building a party if no one's going to come? And I think by that, what they're saying in that kind of clumsy way is, why do we bother doing all this rewilding, restoration work on the rivers when the salmon numbers are vastly decreasing, acutely decreasing in the returning numbers from sea? What would you say to that, to those naysayers?
I think we've got to do it all. I mean, the salmon is the keystone in many rivers. I don't think we really understand quite how important that nutrient transfer is. The mind just simply boggles when you try and consider how many salmon used to swim up European rivers and American rivers, 200, 300, 400 years ago. And imagine even earlier, we'd lost much of our wetlands and done a lot of damage even in Roman times. Now, I read a statistic recently that said that the salmon catch on the River Tweed in 1820 was 1,000 times greater than the salmon catch on the River Tweed in 1920. And on that same river, the salmon catch in 1920 was 1,000 times greater than all the salmon caught in all the British Isles in 2020. So, we've really screwed them up. And I think that one of the aspects that we don't think about is how important that massive dollop of nitrates and phosphates coming up the river and then being scattered through the forest must have been to all ecology. You would have had brown bears and ospreys and otters and all kinds of animals feasting on those fish and then depositing all the nutrients through the forest. And they're very thin, especially up in Scotland, they're very thin soils. Where are they going to get their nutrients from? So the salmon is obviously absolutely key, not just for the sake of being able to fish it and for the joy of seeing them in the river, but for the whole health of the whole landscape. And in order to get the salmon back, we need to do it all. You need to restore the landscapes around the rivers to how they might have been, the vibrant kind of mosaic forests and wetlands and so on. And we need to restore the healthy functioning of those rivers and reduce pollution and all of that. And then we also need to look at what's happening in the estuaries with intensive salmon farming. I have a quiet hope, people will hate this, but I have a quiet hope that sort of lab-grown salmon or some kind of alternative to mass-produce factory farm salmon is going to become commercially viable and in demand. And people say, oh my God, how disgusting. Can you imagine a lab-grown burger or a lab-grown slice of salmon? Well, have they been to a factory farm? Go and have a look inside a factory salmon unit, stuffed with antibiotics, lice everywhere, destroying the ecosystem, the misery of those animals being consumed by the lice on their backs. Think of a factory farm pig unit in Iowa or Nebraska, or a factory feedlot cattle from which most Americans get their burgers. These are abominations. These are the greatest expressions of human dominion and evil over other species. And they're just, from a chemical and biological perspective, they're disgusting things. So the idea that lab grown could even come close as being that disgusting is nonsense to me, and propaganda. And whilst I'm not chomping at the bit to eat a lab-grown salmon steak, I'd like the idea that we can pull the rug out of that industry through that, because salmon industry is a massive part of the problem. And then, of course, commercial industrial netting of fish in the ocean beyond. We need to look at all of those things, and why wouldn't we? And let's just say we don't succeed, and the salmon doesn't recover anything like its former abundance, or God forbid we lose the salmon from a bunch of these rivers, which is terrifyingly looking kind of possible. Well, at least we've restored the landscape, the health of the rivers for those species that do remain. And I think they also we owe it to them, and to ourselves, to restore, what we can, where we can. And we can have a tremendous impact even if we don't have everything that was once there. But I'm an optimist generally, and I do this podcast, Rewilding the World, and pretty much all I do is bring on a guest each fortnight who's got a story of optimism to tell me. The American Prairie Reserve I mentioned, second largest herd of wild bison migrating across Montana now, in an area that was just cattle ranches before, and creating employment and bringing people into connection with nature. Extraordinary restoration of the inshore marine environment following the establishment of no-take zones in the Mediterranean, in Turkey and places, explosions of life. So it does come back. A salmon lays a lot of eggs. It does come back, and we can help it along the way if we restore the habitat and remove the obstacles. So I'm an optimist. I think we can do this, but we need to do it all. We can't have that idea that why would we bother? They may not come.
I absolutely agree with you. I think apathy is certainly not the way forward. It's not a solution. I love your, I share the same view as you with regards to cultivated meat. And I think there is a huge future for it. But there's also a lot to learn. And there's going to have to be a huge cultural shift towards accepting it. But you're right. I think that might actually make a big difference, certainly in the world of salmon farming. You know your onions when it comes to Rewilding the World. You host a podcast, but this is also your business, isn't it? This is what you do. Is there something that you might be able to share with salmon conservationists, people that want to specifically focus on trying to save this species that, as you quite rightly pointed out, is so important, such a keystone species, and has so many things riding off its back when it comes to the improvement of ecosystems and the biodiversity of rivers and catchments? What might you advise us as salmon conservationists?
So I think the restoration of landscapes is going to be one of the most important things that we do to bring back salmon and other migratory fish species. That goes from fixing the river itself, so removing the concrete canalization, rewiggling rivers and doing all that engineering stuff, removing the concrete straitjackets, the weirs and the dams that block their passage and that screw up the river. There's someone said that dams and weirs are a bit like putting blockages in the arteries of a human body. You just do untold harm, much of which we don't fully understand yet. So there's all of that engineering stuff. But remember, on average, during the course of a year, only 1% of the water of a river is in the actual river. 99% is in the surrounding landscape. So if you want to fix the healthy functioning of the river and make it welcoming to species like salmon, you have to do a whole bunch of restoration in the surrounding valleys. And often in the best bits of Salmon River, those aren't agriculturally productive landscapes. We're typically not talking about prime, flat, arable landscapes. We're talking about hills and valleys that are being abused and degraded for low economic upside or no economic upside, overgrazing by subsidized sheep, for example. And so, or sort of marginal Sitka monoculture plantations. Shifting the dial on that kind of land use isn't therefore so difficult because the incentives are so weak already, and they're often provided by governments that are less and less inclined to continue subsidizing public bads, and they want to start buying public goods. Just look at England's new environmental land management scheme. Now, the way I see that scheme, which replaces the old European Union direct payments or unconditional subsidies for farming is it's like a big icebreaker ship, kind of plowing its way through the ice. And in its wake are a flotilla of other markets now which reward restoration and stewardship of nature. So if you've got a plot of land that is not agriculturally productive and you've been running sheep all over it for no good reason other than the subsidy, well, those subsidies are now gone. It was Warren Buffett who said it's only when the tide goes out you can see who's been swimming naked. And so you're now looking for a new business model, and you probably want to continue farming because that's what you and your ancestors have done in that place forever. Well, we talked earlier about natural processes, and the first one I named are native cattle. So replacing your 1,000 sheep with 50 or 100 native cattle is going to allow you to continue farming, continue producing food with a lot less work, because if you get the stocking density and the breeds right, then they can stay out all year round and you don't have to take them a load of imported winter feed and so on. So you have an easier life. And you'll be paid for it now because the nature that will recover will earn you money. And that first and foremost is the public scheme in England, which is likely to get copied, we hope, in some way, shape or form in Scotland, Wales, and the other devolved parts of the United Kingdom. So you have your stewardship payments, but then there are these private markets, such as integrated flood management. Local authorities and the Environment Agency are now paying landowners to restore sensitive parts of the catchment, in other words, good potential salmon habitat, to help protect communities and assets from flooding. In fact, there's even now organizations like Rebalance Earth, which is a new startup backed by the West Yorkshire Pension Fund, that is trying to do that, funded entirely by the private sector. So they're looking at a river. I think their first river is the River Plym in Devon. And they're looking at how it's been artificially canalized and straightened over the generations. And it now is like a fire hose. When it rains, the water just barrels down. And that fire hose is aimed at a bunch of assets that have great value. A food logistics hub, a Ministry of Defence airfield, a network rail, and a national grid substation, and so on. And those assets just can't afford to be offline 12, 14, 18 days a year from flooding. And so you get all those asset owners together in a room and say, look, if you pay a certain amount of money, we will fix this river so that it's no longer a fire hose, so that instead it's a gently meandering watercourse as it once was, with connected to its floodplains, and we'll recreate wetlands and dig out ponds so that when it rains, that 99% of the water which isn't in the river stays not in the river and flows gently down towards you rather than barreling towards you and causing you all kinds of problems. And the deal would be that they would pay that money as an annuity over a period of years, which would then allow those that want to fix the river to raise an institutional bond of some sort in order to do the work. So the integrated flood management, which also deals with the problem of drought and water shortages as well. It's the other side of the same coin. So there's an interest there for the water companies. You've also got nitrate and phosphate mitigation and kind of pollution cleanup markets. Nutrient neutrality is the one we have in England, where landowners are paid to restore healthy rivers and healthy wetlands because those systems eat up nitrates and phosphates, and you can get paid for that now. You've got a regulated biodiversity market in England and hopefully soon in the UK. And you've also got a global voluntary market in nature-based carbon. And so these are just examples of markets that are growing up that recognize that nature has value beyond simply the food that we can produce in that space, that we actually need nature for everything. You see those figures sometimes people bandy around. 50% of global GDP is dependent upon nature. How do they get to 50%? Like, surely it's 100%. Like, everything we have, everything we do is completely dependent upon our life support system, which is nature. And I get the philosophical argument, how do you value something that is intrinsically beyond value, beyond price? But the truth is, we are already valuing nature. We value it at zero in every decision we take. So recognizing the quantifiable value of the things that nature does for us as a kind of infrastructure, if you like, the mother of all infrastructure, I think is a very important economic mechanism. And it needs to go hand in hand with the kind of spiritual and cultural shift we talked about earlier. We need people to fall back in love with nature. We need more than a kind of cold-hearted cost-benefit analysis. We need the love as well, the personhood for rivers and all that Rob McFarlane stuff. But hand in hand with the cultural shift, we need an economic shift that values nature rationally. And I think that's now happening. West Yorkshire Pension Fund have poured equity investment into Rebalance Earth's plan to restore the River Plym, and other rivers can follow. That's just one example. So if we can make nature a financial proposition, with all the risks that carries, we can unlock enormous amounts of funding for restoring nature at scale. You know as well as I do the cost of restoring a single Scottish river, to health for salmon. It's beyond philanthropy, and it's most likely beyond government capability. We need private finance, I think, if we're going to be able to do this at speed and at scale.
Predominantly speaking, is that what you do? Are you creating these vehicles that might help us? I don't want to say monetize nature, because it's kind of the opposite what we want to do, but certainly give it the currency that it deserves and the recognition in those markets, creating markets for nature. Really, is that what you do?
I'm 44, so for the last 25 odd years, I've had two lives, professionally speaking. I've worked on the one hand in green investment, but in a kind of decarbonization sense. So I knew I always wanted to work in investment and finance, and maybe a little bit of that was kind of following in the footsteps of my father, who I admired greatly. And by default, he died when he was 63 and I was 15, and I was the most obvious to be actively involved in our family business, which is an investment business. So I've had to be involved in that, and I've built three green investment businesses, focusing on kind of renewable transition in energy, electrification of transport, water and waste infrastructure, stuff which the world really needs, stuff which is now happening at scale, and stuff in which investors have made money, but perhaps not the kind of stuff that is soul food. And I believe in it, and it's been a fun and interesting thing to do. But I've also on the side devoted a significant amount of my time and effort to nature, because that's what I love, and I've always considered that philanthropy. So kind of working with the Beaver Trust, and I set up the Environmental Funders Network, and I've got a whole bunch of different pies in which I've had a finger, in terms of species reintroductions, rewilding. I was on the board of DEFRA for 5 years, helping to formulate the new environmental payment system. But I've always considered those two things to be separate, and I think now for the first time, it's possible to conceive of a world in which they coalesce, in which I can raise money from the kinds of investors I've always dealt with, but deploy it into nature rather than some other kind of hard infrastructure. And so I teamed up with Charlie Burrell, the chair of NEP, the famous rewilding project in Sussex. And the two of us have set up a thing called Nattergal, which means nightingale in Danish. It's drawn from the Hans Christian Andersen, the nightingale as a symbol of nature renewal. And of course, it is at NEP, the symbol, that and the white stork. And our vision was simple. How can we create new NEPs without, when we don't have the money ourselves necessarily to do that? And we went and raised £40 million from a bunch of investors, Aviva, Lansdowne Capital, and so on. And we've taken charge of 3, soon to be 4 very large pieces of land, all within about 2 hours of London, all ecologically and economically bankrupt. These are not productive pieces of land that we've bought. One of them was pony paddocks. Another one, they were trying to grow daffodils. So, one was growing peas for feeding to factory farmed salmon, and the yields were low. So we are rewilding these landscapes which have had nothing in them. They're just ecologically incredibly barren, and we are trying to generate a financial yield from the process of rewilding. So we have obviously the government schemes in some cases, the new environmental land management scheme payments, but we're also selling nature-based carbon to Arup, for example, the construction company. We're selling biodiversity credits to Bellway Homes, one of the largest home builders in the UK. And we're doing a bit of nature tourism and so on. And if our investors are getting the kind of yield they'd get if they built, say, student accommodation or bridges or toll roads or office blocks in Canary Wharf, if it just becomes normal, the idea that a patch of nature can generate you a financial yield for the quantifiable services that it provides, then I think we unlock massive amounts of money for rewilding on a huge scale. The possibilities are enormous. I mean, think in Portugal, the enormous dead monoculture plantations of eucalyptus, which are a huge fire risk, economically non-viable. No one prints things out anymore. There's no need for paper and pulp in the way that there was. You can buy these for a song, and imagine restoring them to Dehesa, kind of diverse, corks and wild oaks and Mediterranean scrub and forest. And you could do incredible things in a whole bunch of places in the world, but there's just not enough money to do it unless you can make it an investable proposition. And then you've got unlimited money. So that's kind of the goal of this new business, Nattergal. And it's amazing. You stand on the highest point at Boothby, our site near Grantham, and you look out and, we saw quail last time I was there. I've never seen quail in the wild, big flocks of migrating European quail. And you can just about make out that this used to be an intensive farm. You just see the kind of ghost structure of the farm. It's wild. You feel like you're in Africa.
Ben, we're going to finish with the final three questions that we ask our guests. If you had unquantifiable funds, and it's interesting I'm putting this to you because if you had access to unquantifiable funds and you convince people to invest in this question, what would you do with £1 billion to save the wild salmon?
I think, first of all, I would do what's been done very successfully already in a number of places and buy out the netting rights so that you simply can't catch salmon out in the ocean at all. I would then spend money fighting against the salmon farming industry. I want them to be onshore, in tanks, or I want them to move to lab grown. I don't want those salmon farm structures in our estuaries at all. And if we want the salmon back, they have to go. I don't think they can be reformed. So that would be funding a whole bunch of advocacy type work, looking for changes in the law. I mean, if the funds were really unlimited, then I'd simply buy them up and close them down. There's a mining business called Twin Peaks in Southeastern America, and they have been trying to build this huge mine on the edge of the Okefenokee Swamp, which is one of the most important wetlands in the US and the largest federal reserve east of the Mississippi. And I was there with my wife and baby Paloma last year and kayaking around that. And I just couldn't believe that this was all under threat because of one mining company. And so the conservation fund just came in and bought it out, and maybe just simply buying these businesses out, if you had enough money, would be a quicker pathway to closing them down than trying to get the law changed. And then third, I would either buy land, lease land, or create incentives for existing communities and landowners to change the way they manage the valleys and the kind of important parts of those salmon river catchments. I want land use change. We need more trees, more scrub, more gentle grazing with native livestock, being cattle instead of sheep. We need proper deer control. We need wilder, rougher, more functional river systems. And I would achieve that if the money was unlimited. I'd be doing lots of strategic land purchase. Leases would also work fine. And then you can create private incentive structures whereby you pay people a certain amount of money each year to manage land in a certain way. I think that's what I'd do with the money.
I think that's a fantastic use of money. And I will be stealing that for myself, brazenly. Second question, if you had no money, this is to the people at home listening, always wanting to know and always getting in touch with us saying, what can we do? What can we do from home? We don't live in a river. We're not salmon anglers. We're not salmon conservationists, but we care. What can we do? So if you had no money, what would you do to help save the salmon?
I think your day-to-day purchasing choices make a massive difference, first and foremost. Now, and I don't think one needs to be puritanical about it. I never forget a Green Party advert when I was young, where some activists were yelling at someone trying to fill their car up with petrol. What are you doing buying petrol? You don't want to put people off by being overzealous. But I think what people should be encouraged to do is just be mindful in the way they spend their money. Just think, what impact is this purchase having? If you're buying some pork, did it come from a pig that had a basic quality of life? Or did it live a miserable life inside a factory farm? And if you're buying a salmon steak, where the hell did it come from? Should you be buying it at all? I eat very little salmon now. And then the second thing I think matters is engagement politically. And I think that doesn't matter where you sit in terms of the bigger societal questions, left, right, and if that even means anything anymore, but just engaging with candidates, drop them a letter. One MP told me that for every letter that comes in on a topic, they assume 100 people have had the thought, and only 1 in 100 take the time to write the letter. So a polite, short email or a letter saying, please, will you engage with this issue? It matters to me greatly. And that on questions of environment has huge power. And of course, how you vote. And then thirdly, I think giving what you can to organizations doing good stuff. And it doesn't necessarily need to be on a salmon river 600 miles away. It could be something that's happening local to you. But it could be money, and it could be £5 a month to your favorite environment organization, or it could be time. There's lots of volunteering happening now. In London, where I spend a lot of time, there's an organization called Citizen Zoo. And they get hundreds of volunteers at a time, and they descend on a river and they pull out shopping trolleys and they remove Japanese knotweed and they plant native vegetation. And then when the habitat is right, they plot water voles in, or they put 2 beavers in the river at Ealing in the Citizen Zoo, and I think they were called Sigourney Beaver and Justin Beaver, and the mayor himself showed up among the volunteers to release them, and so I think giving your time and your energy, and if you have it, a little bit of money, even if it's a tiny standing order, a couple of pounds a week or something, to an environment organization, that is very powerful.
I think that's brilliant advice. Absolutely. Your choice and how you consume what you consume is the most powerful lever we have to affect change, I think. And I think if we educate ourselves and find out what we're eating, just as you say, and make some more conscientious choices, we could have a huge ripple effect up the chain. Thank you. And the final question, Ben, is it's your last day on Earth, on this Earth, should we say, or in your present form, and you have to spend it anywhere. I think I know the answer to this, but I'm gonna see. You have to spend it anywhere, any fresh body of water. I'm gonna say, where would it be, and who would it be with?
I think it's with my children on the pond here in Canwood in Somerset, where I spend my happiest days, almost no matter what the weather. But when it's Mediterranean like it is today, I have a blissful day in store, and they will potter about the edges and occasionally jump in, and I will swim around my little island, and I will feel very blissed out and very close to nature and very close with the people I love most, and close to Iris, who was a little wild child here in Somerset, in the wilder corners of our farm and in the pond and gallivanting around on her pony with her friends. And so I feel that very strongly. Now, I wondered after losing Iris, would I be able to stay here, after what happened right here? And it dawned on me very quickly and very powerfully that, in fact, I must stay here, and I can't be anywhere else, that my survival depends upon staying here. So I'm by my pond with my children.
That's such a beautiful answer. Ben, the lady who was sat next to your mother at that dinner all those years ago and casually referred to you as the one who liked nature, and I think probably provoked this awakening in you at that young age, I think we have to thank her, because it feels like, certainly I believe, you are going to be and already are hugely important in what I think we're at a corner right now as a society, as a culture, in changing the way we feel about nature, about rivers, about salmon in our case. And I think you are a really, really strong and interesting voice in this space. And we really want to thank you. I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for being on this show and having these enlightening conversations with me, and also for helping me on a personal level think about Ella Jane this morning. I think I want to dedicate this episode to Iris and Ella Jane. And so thank you, Ben. Thank you so much for sharing your morning with us.
Thank you, Jim, so much for having me on. It's been great.
My heartfelt thanks to Ben Goldsmith for joining me on the show today, and don't forget to check out his podcast, Rewilding the World. On the next episode of The Last Salmon, the Norwegian salmon season has finished.
The collapse of Norwegian fisheries is irreversible because they're facing a massive, huge list of basically man-made challenges.
Matt Hayes needs no introduction, perhaps one of the UK's most famous anglers, and Ann-Britt Bogan, both salmon fishery owners on the prestigious Norwegian River Gowler, join me.
Norwegian salmon fishing is different. The fish are bigger, the days are longer. If you're a salmon angler and you want to catch a big salmon, this is still the country to come to.
Listen and follow The Last Salmon on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And remember to keep in the fight for our salmon. The Last Salmon Season 2 is supported by the Missing Salmon Alliance.